Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1886. She was face down in the mud, one shoulder torn open, both palms bleeding, and the hoofbeats were getting closer. She tightened her grip on the broken branch. Back already, or someone worse. A man swung down from his horse, unhurried, hands where she could see them. He looked at the ground before he looked at her. "How many of them?" he said. "Enough," she said. Her voice came out scraped and dry. Then a 9-year-old boy climbed off his pony, knelt down in the mud beside her, and tied his own red wool scarf around the cut on her arm before his father could say a word. "I'm not leaving her here," the boy said. "And that's where everything begins." This is the story of a woman left for dead on a lonely trail, and the people who chose to come back for her. Follow along now so you don't miss a single chapter. The rain started slow, the way bad things usually do. First a chill in the air, then clouds pulling across the sky like a curtain being drawn. Lenora Voss felt the first drops on her face and didn't move. Moving hurt too much. Her cheek was pressed against the dirt. One arm folded underneath her, and somewhere behind her left eye, a pulse throbbed steady as a drumbeat. She was alive. That much she knew. She counted her breaths and tried to piece together what she still had. Both hands, though her palms were raw from crawling. Her coat, though the left shoulder had been torn half off. Her boots, the horseshoe she'd grabbed from the mud without really thinking, back when she still had the presence of mind to grab anything. She shifted it deeper into her coat pocket and pressed her face to the ground again. The trail was empty. The wagon was gone. The men who'd put her here were gone with it, which meant she had maybe an hour before someone decided a witness was worth coming back for. She reached out and found a broken branch in the wet grass. It wouldn't hold her weight for long, but it didn't have to. She just needed to get upright. She just needed to look like she was standing. The sound came first. Hoofbeats, 2 sets, one heavier than the other. She closed her fist around the branch and turned toward the sound and waited. 2 riders came over the low rise. A man and a boy. The man sat straight, broad through the shoulders. His hat pulled low against the rain. The boy was younger than 10, riding a small gray pony that picked its steps carefully in the mud. They saw her at the same moment she saw them. The man pulled up and said nothing for a moment. He scanned the trail, looked left, looked right, then swung down from his horse without hurrying. He moved the way. Careful, men move, hands visible, not reaching for anything. He crouched a few feet away and looked at the ground before he looked at her. She watched him read it the way some people read a page. The drag marks, the boot prints from at least 3 different men, the place where something heavy had been thrown from a wagon. "How many of them?" he said. "Enough," she said. Her voice came out wrong, too dry, scraped thin. He looked at her shoulder, at the blood that had soaked through the torn wool. "Can you stand?" "I'm standing now. You're on one knee." She looked down. He was right. She hadn't noticed. She shifted her weight, and the world tilted, and she grabbed the branch harder. "I'm Hollis Creed," he said. "That's my son, Kit. We run a horse station about 2 miles east. She didn't give her name yet. They'll come back, I know." He looked down the trail again. "That's why I want to move you." "I saw what they were moving," she said. "I shouldn't have. That's the whole problem." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw him file that information away without reacting to it. A practical man. She didn't know yet if that was good or bad. Behind him, the boy had climbed down from his pony. He was small, dark-haired, with mud already on both knees, and he was walking toward her like she was the most important thing he'd seen all week. "Kit," Hollis said, "stay up." The boy didn't stay up. He came and knelt beside her and pulled a red wool scarf from around his own neck, and before Hollis could say another word, the boy had pressed it against the cut on her forearm and held it there with both hands. Lenora looked at him. He looked back at her, serious as a judge. "Kit." Hollis's voice was flat. "Get back on Juniper." "I'm stopping the blood," Kit said. "I can see what you're doing. Then you can see I should keep doing it." Hollis stood very still for a moment. Lenora watched something move behind his eyes. Not anger, exactly. More like a man realizing the argument is already over. She used that moment. He's right, she said. Don't stop him. Hollis looked at her, then at his son, and said, both of you are going to owe me an explanation later. Then he crouched beside Lenora and said, I need to move you onto my horse. I'm going to put my arm here and here. You tell me if something's broken, he asked. Permission before he touched her. She registered that and tucked it away. Nothing was broken, or nothing she could identify through the pain. He lifted her with the kind of steadiness that comes from years of handling animals that don't want to be handled. Careful, no wasted movement. He got her settled across the front of his saddle, and she held the saddle horn with both hands while the rain came down harder. She was already thinking about the horseshoe. She'd found it a few feet from where they'd dragged her. Freshly replaced, recently thrown off, still sharp on the inside curve. She'd grabbed it on instinct. Now, pressed against the cold metal through her coat pocket, she turned it over slowly with her fingers and found what she'd half expected to find. A maker's mark, small, stamped deep into the metal. A specific combination of letters, and a diamond shape she recognized from a horse yard she'd worked at 6 months ago. Everett Sloane's yard. She said nothing. She kept her hand in her pocket, and her eyes on the trail ahead, and waited to see what kind of man Hollis Creed turned out to be. Creed Horse Station appeared through the rain as a cluster of low buildings, a large stable, and a split-rail pasture fence that disappeared into the gray. It was a working place. Nothing pretty about it, but everything functional. Hollis got her inside, what he called the feed room, a small outbuilding attached to the far end of the stable. Clean, dry, smelling of oats and cedar. He settled her against the wall on a folded horse blanket and stood back. You're going to tell me what happened, he said. Later, she said. Someone's coming. He heard them the same moment she did. Horses on the approach road. He looked at her, then at the door, then made a decision in about 3 seconds flat. Stay still, he said, and pulled the door shut behind him. She sat in the dark and listened. 2 riders. They came into the yard at a casual pace, which was worse than if they'd come fast. Fast meant panic. Casual meant they were comfortable. They had time. She heard Hollis's voice, easy and unhurried. Evening. One of the riders said, Name's Kersey. We're looking for a woman, traveling alone. Horse thief. Brown coat, dark hair, might be injured. She stopped breathing. Haven't seen anyone, Hollis said. There was a pause. She heard one of the horses shift, heard a creak of leather. You've got blood on your saddle, Kersey said. Had a foal go bad last week, Hollis said. Don't always get it all off. Another pause. Longer. Then Kersey said, You see anyone, you send word to the Sloane Company office in Briar Hollow. There's a reward. Appreciated, Hollis said. She listened to them leave. Listened to the hoofbeats fade. Listened to the rain. Hollis came back and opened the door and looked at her. She looked back at him. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. I'm going to get the doctor. He was gone less than a minute when she heard it. A horse screaming. Not a whinny, not a challenge. A full scream of pain and fear. Coming from the stable, she was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. She knew that sound. She'd heard it enough times to know it wasn't aggression. It was panic. It was an animal that hurt and didn't understand why, and was telling anyone who'd listen. She pushed open the feed room door and went toward the stable, and the dark and the sound. She left the horseshoe in her pocket. She wasn't ready to show it to anyone yet. The mare was black, 17 hands at least, and she had her hindquarters pressed into the far corner of her stall, with her ears pinned flat. Lenora didn't rush. She stopped in the stable doorway and let the horse see her first. That was the first rule. Let them look. Let them decide you aren't a threat before you get close enough to become one. Easy, she said. Not loud, not soothing. Exactly, just present. A voice in the dark that wasn't running toward her. The mare's ears moved. One forward, one still flat. She was listening, which was better than screaming. Lenora stepped inside and pulled the stable door closed behind her. The lantern on the post threw orange light across the stall. She could see the problem from 6 feet away. The mare had her right front hoof lifted. Weight shifted entirely off it, and every few seconds she'd stamp it down and jerk it back up again. Pain with no exit. That was the panic. "There it is," Lenora said quietly. She moved to the left side, staying in the mare's sight line, and held out her hand at chest height. Not reaching, just offering. The horse lowered her head half an inch. Lenora moved closer, slowly, steadily. She worked her way along the mare's shoulder until she could reach the front leg. She ran her palm down the cannon bone, over the fetlock, and the mare trembled but held still. "Good girl," Lenora said. "I see it." She could feel the stone before she got the hoof up. It had wedged between the shoe and the white line, packed in with mud, pressing into tissue that had no business being pressed. She pulled her folding pick from her coat pocket, the one she carried out of habit, and worked it loose in 3 careful passes. The stone dropped into the straw, less than an inch across. The mare put her foot down flat. Stewed Square blew out a long breath through her nose. Lenora stepped back. Hollis was standing in the stable doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She wasn't attacking, Lenora said. She was in pain. "There's a difference." He looked at the mare, then at Lenora, then at the small stone on the stable floor. "I would have put her in the east paddock until she calmed down. That would have made it worse." He didn't argue. He came in and looked at the hoof himself, running his hand over it the way she had. "How'd you know it was a stone and not a crack?" "The way she was stamping. Cracks hurt steady. Foreign objects hurt with pressure, so they stamp trying to dislodge it. She paused. "It's just pattern recognition. You learn what each thing looks like." He looked up at her. "You've done this a long time, long enough." Dr. Beatrix Wren arrived less than an hour later. She was a compact woman in her 40s with short, gray-streaked hair and a medical bag that had seen better decades. She came through the door, looked at Lenora sitting on the kitchen bench, and said, "Well, you're upright. That's a better start than some." She examined Lenora's arm, her face, her ribs, and her shoulder with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this in worse lighting than a kitchen lantern. She didn't ask many questions during the examination. She waited until she was done, then sat back and looked at Hollis standing in the doorway. "She was beaten and dragged," Beatrix said. "This wasn't a fall." Hollis said nothing. "The shoulder's the worst of it. The arm will close clean." Beatrix began rapping. "She needs rest, and she needs to stay off that shoulder for at least a week. She can stay until she can ride," Hollis said. Lenora looked at him. "That's generous." "It's practical," he said. "I'm not putting an injured woman back on the trail." He crossed his arms. "But I need to know what I'm protecting my son from. Any secret that puts Kit in danger needs to come out now." Lenora had known this was coming. She'd been turning it over since the feed room. "My name is Lenora Voss," she said. "I work with horses. I was traveling through this territory after leaving a position at a yard about 40 miles south." She stopped there. "And the men who did this?" "A wage dispute," she said. "It got out of hand." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. Beatrix raised her eyebrows and said nothing. Hollis looked at Lenora steadily, and she looked back, and the lie sat between them like a stone on a table. He didn't press her. Not yet. The next morning, Kit tried to take his pony out before breakfast. Juniper wouldn't move. The pony stood in the yard with his legs planted and his head down, and no amount of clicking or urging or tugging the lead rope made any difference. Kit looked increasingly frustrated. Hollis came out, watched for a moment, and said the pony had become stubborn. Lenora was sitting on the porch steps with her arm in a sling Beatrix had fashioned from flour sacking. She watched Juniper's face. "It's not stubbornness," she said. Kit turned around. "What is it?" "Bring him to me." Kit led the pony over. Lenora asked Kit to hold the lead rope steady and crouched down, moving slowly on account of her ribs, and lifted Juniper's left front hoof. She saw it immediately. A horseshoe nail driven at the wrong angle, the sharp end curling inward toward the sensitive laminae. not deep enough to cause bleeding. Deep enough to make every step feel like a warning. "Who shot him last?" she asked. "Man in town," Hollis said. "3 weeks back, he drove this nail wrong. It's been pressing further in every time Juniper puts weight on it." She looked up at Kit. He wasn't being stubborn. He was telling you it hurt. Kit's face shifted. "He was trying to tell me?" Horses can't say it in words, so they say it in behavior. Refusing to move is one of the clearest things they can tell you. She set the hoof down gently. "I need a hoof pick and a pair of pullers if you have them." Hollis went to the stable and came back with both. She removed the shoe carefully, cleaned the nail track, and showed Kit exactly where the problem was. "You see this area here? The softer tissue, inside the white line? That's what you never want metal touching." She let Kit look for himself. "When you pick up a hoof going forward, you check for heat first, then look at how the shoe is seated. If a nail is driven too upright, too close to vertical, it can migrate." Kit knelt beside her and studied the hoof with the same seriousness he'd shown the night before. "How do you learn all of this?" "Watching," she said, "and making mistakes and being lucky that the horse forgave me for them." That made him smile. She worked with the horses through the afternoon, which was more than Beatrix would have approved of, but her good arm functioned fine, and the work kept her mind from circling. Hollis's station held 14 horses in varying stages of preparation for sale. She moved between them slowly, reading each one. She found the altered horse in the third paddock. He was a bay gelding, well-muscled and quiet, with a white sock on his left rear leg. From a distance, there was nothing unusual. Up close, she could see where the coat along his left shoulder had grown back at a slightly different angle than the surrounding hair. Someone had applied a chemical to fade the surface color, and the hair underneath had grown in with the original pattern disrupted. She stood very still and looked at the place where a brand should have been. She knew this horse. She'd treated a stone bruise in his right front hoof at a ranch 2 territories east 9 months ago. She remembered him because he'd been unusually calm for a young gelding, and because his owner had been proud of him in the distracted way people are proud of things they love but take for granted. His name had been Ridgeline. She looked at the stock tag wired to the fence post. The tag bore the seller's information. Everett Sloan, Briar Hollow Livestock Company. She straightened up and kept her face neutral and walked back toward the stable. She needed to know who had sold Hollis this horse before she said anything. She needed to understand whether Hollis knew what he'd bought. That night, she lay in the small room off the kitchen that Hollis had cleared for her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the station settle around her. The wind in the pasture. Somewhere one of the horses shifted and blew out a breath. She thought about Ridgeline. She thought about the horseshoe in her coat pocket. She thought about whether a man who asked permission before touching an injured stranger, who let his 9-year-old son argue him into a decision and lost with dignity, was the kind of man who bought stolen horses. She didn't think so, but thinking so wasn't knowing so. She made a decision. She would stay long enough to find out who sold Hollis that gelding. She would stay long enough to understand how deep the operation ran. She was still working out what she'd do after that when she finally slept. Dawn came gray and cold. She heard Hollis's boots on the porch and then heard him go still. She was already sitting up when he came through the kitchen door. His face told her before he spoke. 3 horses gone, he said. Fence cut near the road. She was on her feet, reaching for her coat. Kit's pony, he said. Juniper's gone with them. Kit heard it from his bedroom and came down the stairs at a run, still pulling on his boot. Juniper's gone? Hollis put a hand on his son's shoulder. We'll get him back. He can't walk right yet. He's going to hurt himself. Kit's voice was controlled, but only barely. He was 9 years old, and his pony was gone. And he was working very hard not to show how frightened he was. We have to go now, I know, Hollis said. He was already reading the ground. The fence had been cut cleanly. 2 strands of wire snipped and folded back. the kind of work done by someone who'd done it before, and wasn't in a hurry. Multiple horse tracks led through the gap and turned south toward the low-grass country. The rain from the past 2 days had softened the ground and then hardened it again overnight, and the tracks near the fence were mixed together, different sizes, different gaits, pressed over each other until they looked like a crowd had passed through all at once. Hollis crouched. He studied it for a long moment. Then he stood up and said, "I can't separate them." Lenora came up beside him. She'd moved carefully, mindful of her shoulder, but her eyes were already working. "I can," she said. He looked at her. "Juniper's left front hoof is unshod right now, because I pulled the shoe yesterday," she said. "His right front is still shod. That's an uneven pattern you won't find in any of these other horses." She pointed to a print near the fence post. "That's him. See how the left side has no shoe impression? Just the hoof wall slightly wider than the right." Hollis crouched again and looked where she pointed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." She moved along the track line slowly, stepping wide to avoid disturbing the prints, narrating as she went. "Unshod left front, wider impression. Shod right front, clean edge. The stride was shorter than the other horses. Slightly uneven, favoring the heeling hoof. Juniper's limping," Kit said quietly. "Slightly," Lenora said. "Not badly. But it means he's leaving a pattern nobody else here is leaving. Once we get past this section where everything's mixed up, I can find him." Hollis looked at her for a long moment. "You're not riding anywhere on that shoulder. I can manage a horse with one arm better than most people can with two. That's not the point. You need me to read these tracks," she said. "You know you do. We can have this argument, or we can go get the pony." Kit looked at his father. Hollis looked at Lenora. The argument ended. Beatrix arrived at the station as they were saddling up. When Hollis explained, she agreed without being asked to stay with Kit until they returned. Kit objected to being left. Hollis told him that someone needed to watch the remaining horses in case the thieves came back, and that Kit was the most reliable person for that job. Kit accepted this with the particular gravity of a child who has been told something true and knows it. They rode south. The mixed tracks held for the first quarter-mile, then thinned as the herd was split or moved single file through a narrow gully. Lenora picked up Juniper's pattern on the far side of the gully without slowing down. Hollis watched her work and didn't speak. She read tracks the way a good reader reads a page, not word by word, but in whole phrases, processing several things at once. The depth of a print told her weight and speed. The angle told her direction and confidence. She looked at broken grass, at disturbances in dried mud, at the small marks that hooves leave on the underside of stones when a horse steps over them. "They're moving fast, but not running," she said. "They want to be somewhere before full light." "You learn to track horses specifically, or just tracking in general?" Hollis asked. "Horses specifically. Every horse has a particular way of moving. A short-strided horse on a long journey starts to fatigue differently from a long-strided one. An old injury changes how the whole body compensates." She paused. "Juniper is compensating well. He's not in serious distress." Hollis nodded. She saw him absorb the information and hold it. They found the dry creek bed where the trails split, and she took them left without hesitating. Another mile south, through a stand of pale cottonwoods with their leaves already going yellow, and the holding pen appeared. It was old, built from rough cedar posts and wire, tucked into a hollow where you'd never find it unless you were looking. It sat empty now, the gate open, but the ground around it told the whole story. Many horses, many different shoes. Long stay. Hollis climbed down and walked the perimeter. Lenora moved to the center of the pen. Scattered in the dirt and kicked into the corners, short strips of thick leather, charred on their outer surfaces, the stitching burned away. She picked one up and turned it over. "Brand covers," she said. "You cut them to shape, soak them in something to make them pliable, and press them over an existing brand while you apply a new one. The leather holds the heat and makes the scar take a different shape." She set it down. Then you burn the covers so there's nothing to find. Hollis looked at the burned leather in the dirt. Someone's been running horses through here. A lot of horses. Over a long period, she looked at the disturbed ground, reading the layers. Different trips, different seasons. Juniper was tied behind the pen, lead rope looped around a cedar post, eating dry grass with the focused attention of a horse that has decided to make the best of things. His left front hoof was lifted slightly, but not dramatically. When Lenora came around the corner, he raised his head and flicked his ears forward. "There he is," she said. She untied him and ran her hand down his leg. The hoof was warm, but not hot. He'd be fine. The other stolen horses were gone. Hollis found the shipping tag caught on a low branch at the southern edge of the pen. It was printed, not handwritten, which meant it came from a company with enough volume to print its paperwork. He read it twice, and then held it out to her. Sloan Briar Hollow Livestock Company, it said along the top. A consignment number below that. She looked at it and felt the morning air go colder. Hoofbeats, coming from the south, not rushing, just moving along the creek bed with the ease of men who owned the land they were crossing. Hollis looked at her. She looked at Juniper. She stepped close to the pony and put her mouth near his ear and clicked once. Very quietly, the sound her tongue made against the roof of her mouth. He knew it from their work the day before. His ears swiveled toward her. The 3 stolen horses that had been left loose at the edge of the cottonwoods lifted their heads. She clicked again, slightly longer this time. Juniper stepped toward her. The loose horses began moving in the same direction, following the ponies lead the way. Loose horses follow whatever seems most purposeful. "Go north," she said quietly to Hollis. "Slow. If we run, they scatter, and the riders hear it." He looked at her. "You're going to walk them out. They're already following. Just don't give them a reason to stop." He took Juniper's lead rope and began walking north along the creek bank, easy and unhurried. The loose horses fell in behind. Lenora came last, keeping herself between the horses and the sound of the approaching riders. They made the cottonwoods stand before the riders entered the hollow. She could see the men from between the pale trunks, 2 of them, moving along the creek bed. One rode a dark horse with an unusual dragging step in the rear left. The hoof swings slightly outward with every stride. She knew that gait. She'd seen it once before, briefly, at the edge of Creed Station's yard, when the men came asking after a female horse thief. An untreated rear hoof problem, probably a deep crack left to worsen. The horse moved through it, because horses do, but the hitch was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Blam Kersey, she was certain. They waited in the cottonwoods until the sound faded north toward the hollow, then moved. Hollis kept the pace controlled, and the horses stayed together. And in 20 minutes, they were back on the open prairie with Creed Station visible to the east. Hollis said, "You recognized one of their horses." It wasn't a question. "Kersey's," she said. "Rear left hoof. He's got a crack that's been neglected. It changes how the horse moves." She paused. "I've seen it before, at Sloan's yard." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "You said it was a wage dispute." She was quiet for a long moment. Juniper walked steadily between them, content now, ears relaxed. "I worked at Sloan's horse yard for 4 months, she said finally. "I saw horses come in that didn't match their papers. I saw marks altered. I didn't understand the full scope of it until I'd already been there long enough to be considered a problem." She stopped. "That's what started this. I saw something I shouldn't have, and someone decided I'd seen too much." Hollis listened. He didn't interrupt her. "The shipping tag," she said. "That and what I know and what I can identify. That's enough to be dangerous to them." She looked at him. "That's why I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know if you were connected to him, and now I don't think you are." He rode quietly for a while. The station fence appeared ahead. "I'll help you expose him," he said. "But Kit comes first. We don't move until he's somewhere safe." She nodded. It was the first thing that felt like a plan. They rode through the station gate, and Kit came off the porch at a run, and Juniper, for his part, walked toward the boy with his ears pricked forward and his head low, which was as close as a pony could come to an apology. Kit put both arms around the gray neck and held on. Hollis took the shipping tag from his pocket and looked at it again. Then Beatrix appeared in the doorway and said, "A man came while you were gone. Dressed well, silver watch, offered to buy every horse on the property." She paused. He left his card. She held it out. Hollis took it. Sloan Briar Hollow Livestock Company, it said. Briar Hollow on a market day looked prosperous from a distance. Closer in, you could see the cracks, the paint peeling off the livestock office, the way certain men stood near certain buildings and watched who came and went, the way the buyers at the auction rail laughed a little too easily when the well-dressed man in the gray coat made a joke. Everett Sloan was not what Lenora had expected Hollis to picture. He wasn't large or loud. He was medium height, silver-haired, with the patient face of a man who had learned that waiting was more effective than threatening. He stood outside the livestock market with his hands in his coat pockets and smiled at people as they passed. Lenora pulled her hat brim lower. "That's him," Hollis looked. "The one near the gate? Don't stare." He looked away. "He came to my station personally." "He does things personally," she said. "That's how he keeps control." Personal contact, personal favors, makes people feel they owe him something before they realize what they've agreed to. They moved along the opposite side of the street. Lenora kept her head angled slightly down while her eyes moved across the livestock pens beside the market building. She counted 8 horses in the first pen alone. Bay, chestnut, 2 grays. She recognized the larger gray. She'd seen that horse in a pasture 200 miles east, belonging to a rancher named Fielding, who'd bragged about the animal's bloodline for 20 minutes straight. The brand on the gray's left hip had been worked over, the original mark obscured by a second burn laid across it at an angle. Standard technique. Sloppy execution. If you knew what the original brand had looked like, you could still see its ghost underneath. She kept walking. Sloan spotted Hollis before they reached the market entrance. He crossed the street with his hand already extended, smiling like a man greeting an old friend. "Mr. Creed, glad I caught you." He shook Hollis's hand. "I hope my visit yesterday wasn't an inconvenience. I should have sent word ahead." "No trouble," Hollis said. Sloan's eyes moved to Lenora for half a second. No recognition crossed his face. Not a flicker. She'd worked in his yard for 4 months, eaten in his bunkhouse, treated his horses, and he looked at her like she was a fence post. "I wanted to discuss that contract in person," Sloan said. "The new stage route needs reliable horses, and I'd rather work with established operators than deal with auction stock." He spread his hands. "Better for everyone." "That's a generous offer," Hollis said. "The territory's growing, Mr. Creed. Men who position themselves correctly now won't regret it." Sloan smiled again. "Think it over. My office is open all week." He walked back toward the livestock market without looking at Lenora again. Hollis watched him go. "He knows you're here." "Yes," Lenora said. "He's deciding what to do about it." Tamsin Hale ran the boarding house on the north end of Main Street, a narrow 2-story building with blue curtains in every window. She took one look at Lenora on her doorstep and said, "Come through the back," before Lenora had said a word. The back room was small and smelled of dried lavender and old wood. Tamsin poured coffee, without asking, and sat down across from them. Hollis asked about Asa, while Lenora wrapped her hands around the mug. Tamsin shook her head. "I haven't heard his name in over a year. Last I knew, he was moving horses east for a buyer and never came back." "Orson Fitch might know more," Lenora said. Tamsin gave her a careful look. "You know Orson?" "By reputation." Orson Fitch was 70 years old and had driven stage routes across 3 territories before his knees gave out. He was sitting on a barrel behind the feed store when Hollis found him, whittling something that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. He listened to Hollis's questions about Asa without interrupting. Then he put down his knife and looked at the middle distance. "Asa, Creed came through here, asking about livestock movement," he said. This would have been 2.5 years back. He had questions about which routes went south without crossing any official inspection points. Why would he ask that? Hollis said. Because that's how you move stolen horses without getting caught. You use the old trails, the ones that predate the territory registry. Orson looked at him. Sloan controls those routes, has for years. Everybody who needs to know, knows. Everybody who doesn't, doesn't. Hollis was quiet, Lenora said. Asa came to Sloane's yard once. I saw him briefly. He was asking about a specific horse. She paused. I didn't know who he was at the time. I didn't know his name. Hollis turned to look at her. I only put it together later, she said, when I understood more of what Sloane was doing. A man came asking questions. Sloane's foreman turned him away, and then nobody saw him again. She kept her voice steady. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know it was your brother until you said his name at the station. Hollis said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was controlled in the way. That meant he was working to keep it that way. How long did you know the connection? Since you mentioned him on the first night, I wasn't certain, but you suspected. Yes, the silence between them had weight to it. Orson looked away and found something to study on the horizon. I was afraid, Lenora said. Telling you something I couldn't prove didn't seem helpful. Telling you something that might send you after Sloane without enough information seemed worse. Hollis stood up. Let's go back inside. He didn't say he forgave her. He didn't say he understood. But he moved forward, which was something. Sloane's men came to Tamsin's rooms in the early afternoon. Two of them, polite about it, claiming they were looking for a missing woman on behalf of her employer. Tamsin told them she ran a boarding house for paying guests and had nothing to report. She closed the door on them calmly and then turned and pointed at Lenora toward the back staircase. Beatrix had brought Kit to town for supplies. Kit appeared at Tamsin's back door at the worst possible moment, 5 minutes after the men left, and very nearly announced Lenora's name at full volume before Hollis caught him by the collar. Kit looked around the room, registered the tension, and immediately understood that something was wrong. He sat down and said nothing. They were watching from Tamsin's side window when Bram came back out of the livestock office and started toward the street. He stopped near a group of buyers at the auction rail, and Lenora saw him scanning faces. Looking for her, then Bram moved toward Kit, who was still standing near Beatrix at the edge of the crowd. Something in his posture said he'd recognized the boy. Lenora moved before she'd decided to. She slipped out Tamsin's side door and came around the building's edge and was behind Bram in time to see him reach out and grab Kit's arm. She didn't touch him. She stood 3 feet away and said clearly, in a carrying voice, that man sold my neighbor a lame horse last spring. Collected full payment and was gone before. The animal came up lame 2 days later. The buyers at the rail turned around. Bram went still. Ask him about the bay with the bad rear left, she said. The one he's been riding with an untreated hoof crack for 6 months because he can't be bothered. Bram released Kit's arm. He looked at her. His face was not pleasant. You'd better watch what you say, he told her. And you'd better watch how you grab a child, she said. Bram left. The buyers turned back to the auction rail, and Kit quietly moved to stand beside Lenora. Hollis came out of Tamsin's door and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that she hadn't already handled. But that afternoon, Sloane climbed onto the auction platform and announced, in a helpful tone, that there was a warrant out for a woman named Lenora Voss, who had stolen money and horses from his company. He described her clearly: hair, height, coat, the shoulder injury. He smiled the whole time. On their way out of town, Orson stopped Hollis on the back road and pressed a worn saddlebag into his hands. Your brother left this with me, he said. Told me to hold it. Said, if he didn't come back in 6 months, I should find you. He looked at the ground. I waited too long. I'm sorry for that. Hollis opened the bag on the road, with the evening light coming down low and gold through the cottonwoods. Inside was a single horseshoe wrapped in a piece of canvas cloth. The cloth was stained dark with dried blood. Lenora took the horseshoe out of the canvas and held it in the light. She didn't need long. The maker's mark was the same one she'd found pressed into the mud beside the trail the night Hollis and Kit found her. A small diamond with 2 letters inside, stamped deep enough to last 100 years. This came from Sloane's private yard, she said, not the public operation. He has a separate smithing setup for horses he doesn't want documented. Hollis looked at the shoe. Asa had it, which means Asa got close enough to Sloane's private operation to take physical evidence. She turned it over. Along the inside curve, barely visible, someone had used a small file to cut a shallow notch into the metal, a deliberate mark. Personal. Kit was the one who saw it. That looks like a letter, he said. He tilted his head, like an A. Hollis took the shoe and looked at it for a long time. Asa marked his equipment that way, he said finally. Started when we were young, so we could tell our gear apart. His voice was even, too even. He always made the A. Nobody said anything for a moment. Orson cleared his throat. There's a canyon about 12 miles south. Natural hollow, good grass, fed by a spring that doesn't dry out. Sloane's been using it to hold horses before he moves them south. He looked at Hollis. I know how to get there. I drove wagons through that country for 15 years. Hollis looked at the horseshoe once more, then wrapped it back in the canvas and put it in his coat. Tomorrow, he said. They rode out before the air had fully warmed. Orson knew a route that kept them off the main roads, following old cattle trails that wound through pale grass and low rock outcroppings. Kit came with them, over Hollis's initial objection, because leaving him alone at the station after what had happened seemed worse than keeping him close. They found the abandoned church stable around mid-morning. It sat at the edge of a dry canyon, 3 walls still standing, the 4th fallen inward, the roof mostly gone. Whoever had built it had chosen the location for the water, a shallow spring that seeped out of the rock face 20 yards east and fed a narrow channel through the grass. Hollis told Kit to stay near the horses at the canyon rim, with insight, with clear instructions. If anyone appeared on the south trail, he was to ride back the way they'd come and not stop. Kit agreed. He was getting better at accepting the instructions that actually made sense. Inside the stable, Lenora moved carefully. The floor was packed dirt, covered with old straw and the evidence of heavy use. She found the hair dye first. 3 dark bottles, oil-based, the kind used to temporarily change a horse's coat color. Applied over white stockings or facial markings, it could buy you enough time to get through a distant market. This doesn't last, she said. Rain or a good brushing and it's gone. So they use it for short-distance movement. Get the horse somewhere before it wears off, then do the real work. The branding tools were stacked against the remaining back wall. The irons themselves were standard. The modifications were not. Several had been filed down, their original shapes altered to create marks that looked official, but corresponded to no registered brand in any territory record she'd ever seen. Sloane's own marks, custom designed to pass casual inspection. Show me the difference, Hollis said. She held 2 irons side by side. This one is legitimate. See how the lines are clean and consistent? Registered brands are designed to be simple and clear because a rancher needs to identify his stock from 50 feet away. She picked up the altered one. This one has irregular depth. The metal was filed after the iron was cast. It produces a scar that looks like a brand, but doesn't match anything on record. When the inspector asks for paperwork, Sloane supplies documents he's had printed in a town 300 miles away. Hollis studied both irons. How do you prove that? You find the original brand underneath. Heat and time fade a brand somewhat, but the original scar tissue is still there. A veterinarian or livestock inspector who knows what to look for can read it. She set the irons down. That's what I can do. Identify the originals. He looked at her. You've been doing this the whole time. At the station, I found one of your horses the second day, she said. A bay gelding. He came from a ranch in the Eastern Territory. His mark was covered with altered hair growth. She paused. I was trying to determine whether you knew what you'd bought, and I don't believe you did. He accepted this without visible reaction, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he processed things, not indifference. Internalization. The mare came out of the trees while they were still working through the stable. She appeared at the open wall, chestnut, her coat rough and dull, a scar running along her left shoulder from something that had healed badly. She stood at the edge of the shadow and looked at them with large, careful eyes. Lenora went absolutely still. Hollis, she said quietly, don't move. She took one slow step toward the mare. The horse raised her head. Lenora stopped. She put two fingers to her mouth and made a sound. Low, falling, 3 notes. A whistle she'd learned from a man who'd taught her to work horses at 16 years old, and which she'd used exactly the same way every time since. The mare's ears came forward. She took 2 steps into the stable, then stopped, then 2 more. She put her nose 6 inches from Lenora's outstretched hand and blew out a long breath. Lark, Lenora said softly. The horse pressed her nose against Lenora's palm. You know her, Hollis said. Asa raised her from birth, Lenora said. I met her at his ranch once, years ago, before I understood what was happening with Sloan. She ran her hand slowly up the mare's face. She's been here a long time. Look at this shoulder. This scar is old. She was hurt in transport, and it wasn't treated properly. Hollis came forward slowly. He held out his hand and made a low sound. Nothing formal, just a voice the horse might remember. Lark shifted her weight toward him, and then, carefully, pushed her nose against his shoulder. Something moved in Hollis's face, and then was gone. Good girl, he said. It came out rough. The saddle on Lark's back was unfamiliar, cheap leather, poorly fitted. Lenora ran her hand under the flap and felt a ridge that didn't belong. She lifted the flap. A folded piece of paper had been stitched into a gap between the leather layers. The stitching was recent, done with the kind of rough thread you found in a stable kit. She pulled it free and handed it to Hollis without reading it. He unfolded it. Read it once. Read it again. It's Asa's handwriting, he said. She waited. He found Sloane's main herd, Hollis said. He knows where it is. He read further, his jaw tightening. He says, don't trust anyone wearing the silver spur. He lowered the paper. That's all. The storm came faster than any of them expected. One moment the canyon was dry and still, and then the wind hit the remaining stable walls and the old roof timbers groaned, and one of the crossbeams gave way with a sound like a rifle shot. Hollis pulled Lenora back. She'd had her hand on Lark's bridle, and when she moved, the force of it went through her healing shoulder, and she heard herself make a sharp sound. He caught her with one arm, and they moved for the gap in the wall. Lark following, because the horse didn't want to be inside any more than they did. Kit appeared at the canyon rim, doing exactly what he'd been told not to do, which was come back when something went wrong. I saw the roof go, he said. He looked at Lenora. Are you hurt? I'm fine, she said, which was partially true. You're holding your shoulder. Then I'm fine with one shoulder, she said. Hollis helped her away from the collapsing stable without asking this time. She let him. They settled in the shelter of a rock overhang while the storm moved through. All 3 of them, and Lark, who stood at the edge of the overhang with her eyes half closed and her ears turned back against the rain. Hollis said, quiet enough that Kit couldn't hear over the wind. I never looked for Asa hard enough. When he first went missing, I told myself he'd gone further east. I told myself he'd send word. He stopped. I knew something was wrong, and I stayed at the station because I had Kit and the horses, and 100 reasons that felt real at the time, Lenora said. You couldn't have known. I knew enough to know more. She thought about the yards she'd worked, the towns she'd passed through in a hurry, the places she'd left before anyone could ask her to stay long enough to be missed. I've spent years leaving before I could find out whether a place was worth staying for, she said. Every time something started to matter, I found a reason it was time to move on. She watched the rain come down off the canyon rim in thin curtains. I told myself it was practical. Horses don't stay in one place. Neither should the people who care for them. And now? She looked at Lark, standing steady in the rain. Now I think I was just afraid, she said. Hollis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, whatever happens with Sloane, you're free to go whenever you choose. I want you to know that. I'm not holding you here. She turned to look at him. His expression was careful and open at the same time, and she understood what it cost him to say it. I know, she said. She meant it as a beginning, not an ending. The storm cleared by late afternoon, and they rode for home with Lark following Hollis's horse on a loose lead, the mare stepping carefully over the wet ground, still thin, still scarred, but moving steadily enough. They came over the last rise before Creed Station as the light was going gold. Every building was surrounded by armed men. They pulled up behind the tree line and watched. 6 men that Lenora could count. 2 near the stable, 2 at the pasture gate, 1 on the porch, 1 walking the perimeter of the yard with the slow patience of someone who wasn't planning to leave any time soon. Bram Kersey stood near the well with his thumbs hooked in his belt, talking to someone inside the main house. Kit made a small sound. Hollis put his hand on the boy's arm without speaking. Lenora counted the horses. She counted the positions. She looked at the drainage channel that ran along the north side of the property, barely a foot deep, cutting through the grass toward the back of the house. Beatrix is inside, Hollis said quietly. She was supposed to come to town this morning. She came back early, Lenora said. I think she stayed. He looked at her. She's practical, Lenora said. She would have known something was wrong when she saw them arrive. She'd stay because Kit might need her. Hollis handed Kit his reins. You stay here with Lark and Juniper. You do not move from this spot. Kit nodded. He was pale, but he wasn't shaking. They came in from the east, on foot, using the tree line until it ran out, and then moving low through the grass. Bram's voice carried on the still air. Confident, the voice of a man making an announcement he'd enjoyed preparing. They reached the porch side of the house in time to hear him, Mr. Creed. Mr. Sloane has purchased the outstanding note on your operation. The account was held by the Territorial Lending Company. Bram held out a folded paper. You'll find everything in order. Hollis took the paper. Read it once. Handed it back. I'm not surrendering my station, he said. Bram shrugged like it didn't matter much either way. Mr. Sloane anticipated some reluctance. He's asked to speak with you directly. He nodded toward the far end of the yard. Everett Sloane came around the corner of the stable with his hands in his coat pockets, unhurried, looking at the property the way buyers look at things they've already decided to acquire. He stopped a few feet from Hollis and looked past him at Lenora. He smiled. Miss Voss, he said. You look better than the last time I saw you. She didn't respond to that. I'll be brief, Sloane said. I have a legal claim to Mr. Creed's horses. I intend to exercise it. He looked at Hollis. Mr. Creed's son will be well taken care of. I know people in Cheyenne who run excellent facilities for children in difficult circumstances. Hollis went very still. Or, Sloane said, turning back to Lenora, Miss Voss leaves with me now. Mr. Creed's debt is forgiven. Horses stay on his property. His son goes to school in Briar Hollow. He spread his hands. Simple. Lenora looked at him. She let a silence pass, just long enough. Let me see the stallion, she said. Sloane's expression didn't change. I beg your pardon? The gray stallion in the far paddock. Let me look at him while I think. Bram glanced at Sloane. Sloane, after a moment, nodded once. Lenora walked to the paddock with the easy pace of someone who hadn't made up her mind yet. The gray stallion stood near the fence, large-framed, well-muscled, with the particular presence of a horse that had been bred for something specific. She rested her arms on the top rail and looked at him for a while. Then she looked at his left hip. The brand there was clean, properly applied, but the hair around it grew in 2 different directions, a small pattern disruption that most people would never notice. She'd seen it before. A second brand applied months after the first one, close enough in placement that you'd think it was the original. Military. The breeding programs run out of the Eastern Territories used a specific diamond mark, and underneath the current scar, she could see the ghost of it. A horse stolen from a federal program was not a ranch problem or a territorial problem. It was a federal problem. That was an entirely different category of trouble. She came back to where Hollis was standing. "No," she said. Sloane's patience thinned, just slightly. "Miss Voss," I said. "No," she said. "That's the answer." Hollis looked at her. She couldn't read his face, which meant he was working at it. "Lenora," he said, "if you have a chance to get clear." "That's my decision to make," she said. "Not yours." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect you." "I know you are," she said. "But protecting someone doesn't give you ownership over what they choose." She held his gaze. "I'm not leaving." Sloane watched this exchange with the interest of a man cataloging information. Then he nodded to his men at the pasture gate. They began leading horses out. Hollis took one step forward, and Bram put a hand on his chest. And Hollis stopped, not because of Bram, but because he looked over Bram's shoulder and saw Kit at the edge of the tree line, not where he'd been told to stay, watching everything with his eyes wide. Lenora saw it too. She turned to look at the horses being led from the pasture and raised her voice. "That dark chestnut belongs to Clara Dent. She's a widow on the Millbrook Road. Check the right ear." She notches her stock, she pointed. "The roan beside her is Garrett Fowler's. He's been looking for that animal since spring." One of Sloane's own men looked at the roan, then looked away quickly. Beatrix appeared at the side door of the house. She glanced at the scene, glanced at Lenora, and then quietly put her hand on Kit's shoulder and steered him toward the house. Lenora watched them go. Then she looked at Hollis. She looked at him long enough to say what words would have taken longer to get right. He looked back at her. She saw him understand. He stepped toward Bram and let Bram put hands on him. He didn't fight. He let them take him, and he looked only once more in her direction before Bram walked him toward the station's main room. Beatrix moved fast once the men's attention was elsewhere. She had the drainage channel cleared in the time it took Lenora to circle back through the grass. Kit went first, then Lenora, then Beatrix herself, moving low and quiet through the channel while Sloane's men argued about paperwork at the pasture gate. They came up behind the north fence and walked into the trees, and Kit found Lark and Juniper where they'd left them. Lenora put Kit up on Juniper and checked the pony's gait before she mounted her own horse. The line shack was 2 miles northeast, tucked into a hillside, so well that you could ride past it twice before you saw the roof. Hollis had mentioned it once, in passing, the first day. She'd filed it away. Inside, a cot, a wood stove, a small store of dry goods, a window facing south with a clear view of the main road. Kit sat on the cot and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Lenora, are you going to go with him?" The man in the coat. "No," she said. "Are you going to leave?" She looked at him. "I'm going to get your father back." Kit pulled Oss's saddlebag from under his jacket. He'd had it the entire time, tucked under his coat, while he'd stood at the tree line. He set it on the cot and opened it. Lenora stared at him. "How did you—" "I heard you say it was important," he said. She picked up the saddlebag and found the second note. It was smaller than the first, folded into quarters and tucked beneath the lining. Ass's handwriting again, but faster this time, harder to read, like he'd written it in poor light. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Beatrix standing in the doorway. "The man wearing the silver spur," she said. Asa named him. She read the name out loud. "Orson Fitch." Kit's first word was no. He said it the way a child says it when something true arrives, and the heart refuses it before the mind catches up. He sat on the cot with his hands in his lap and said, "Orson wouldn't. He helped us." "I know it feels that way," Lenora said. "It doesn't feel that way. It is that way. He gave your father the saddlebag." She reread the note. She'd been doing that since she found it, turning the words around, looking for another interpretation. Asa had written, "The man wearing Sloane's silver spur knows every route. He rode for him. He is sorry. He told me so himself. Do not trust him until he proves it in action, not in words." She put the note down. That's not an accusation, she said slowly. It's a warning about trust. She looked at Beatrix. Asa knew what Orson had done. But the last line, Asa said don't trust him until he proves it in action. Beatrix raised an eyebrow. You think Asa was trying to turn him. I think Asa succeeded, Lenora said. And then something went wrong. It was a mile to Orson's cabin, a short ride through dry brush and pale grass. Beatrix stayed with Kit. Lenora went alone, which wasn't what Beatrix preferred but accepted because the alternative was bringing Kit, and that wasn't a choice at all. Orson opened his door before she knocked. He'd heard the horse. He looked at her face, and then at her hands, and he said, "Come in." He had coffee on, and a fire going, and the silver spur sitting on the mantel above the fireplace, which was either the act of a man with nothing to hide or a man too tired to hide anything anymore. Lenora sat down and told him what she'd found. He listened. He didn't deny it. I drove Sloane's herds for 2 years, he said. Night routes, mostly. I knew the trails, and I knew how to move animals without drawing attention. He looked at the fire. He paid well, and I asked few questions. That's the honest accounting of it. When did Asa find out? He followed one of the routes south on his own. Came back and knocked on my door. Orson's voice was flat. He didn't threaten me. He just sat down and told me what he'd seen and asked me if I wanted to spend whatever years I had left doing this. A pause. He was a reasonable man, your brother-in-law. He's not. She stopped. Not yet. The spur was Sloane's. A gift when I came on. I kept it because reminding myself what I'd done seemed more useful than pretending I hadn't. He looked at it on the mantel. I gave Asa everything I knew. The routes, the timing, the canyon location. He was building a case. He needed someone to verify what he'd found with their own testimony. And then he disappeared. And then he disappeared, Orson said. I sent word through 3 different people. Nothing came back. I started to think Sloane had found him. He looked at her. Or found out about me. Why didn't you come to Hollis? Because I was afraid, he said simply. And because I didn't know whether telling Hollis would help his brother or just get Hollis killed. He picked up his coffee cup. I kept the saddlebag because Asa asked me to. Held it 2 years. When I finally gave it to Hollis, it was because I ran out of better options. Lenora sat with this for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. Asa may still be alive, she said. Sloane would keep someone with his skills. Good with difficult horses, knows the operation, could be useful. She looked at Orson. The canyon, can you get us there? I can, he said. But I'll need to convince Bram I'm still on Sloane's side to do it. That's a considerable risk to you. Yes, it is, Orson said. I suppose that's the action part your brother-in-law was talking about. She went to get Hollis next. That was the order she'd settled on during the ride to Orson's. Free Hollis, then plan the canyon. Sloane was using the main room of Creed's station as his office. That put Hollis somewhere in the back of the property, most likely the supply room off the stable, which was the most secure space on the grounds. She came in through the east window of the stable. Nobody was watching that side, because nobody with sense approached from the open pasture side at night. Lenora came from the feed room roof, which required her shoulder to do something it protested, and dropped into the hayloft. The supply room door had a simple bar lock. She lifted it from the inside with a thin piece of hoop iron she'd taken from Orson's fence repair kit. Hollis was on his feet before the door opened. He saw her, and something crossed his face that he didn't try to hide. Relief, and underneath it, something sharper that she didn't have a name for. You should have taken a horse and gone north, he said. Good evening to you, too, she said. Lenora, I didn't stay because I needed rescuing, she said. I stayed because I chose to. You and Kit, she held his gaze. That's the whole explanation. I'm done having shorter versions of it. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't know how to protect people without trying to run everything, he said. I've known that about myself for a while. It doesn't seem to be improving. It's improving, she said, slowly. He almost smiled. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, his hand briefly against her jaw, and she turned toward it. Without deciding to, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he kissed her. It was brief and careful, and completely serious, the way important things usually are when they finally arrive. A guard's boot fell on the stable floor above them. They separated. Hollis looked toward the sound, and Lenora looked at the door. Footsteps, 2 sets, moving toward them. She reached back and found his hand in the dark. Then the door swung open, and Bram stood in the light, with 4 men behind him, and behind Bram, looking at the ground, stood Orson Fitch. Bram looked at them. He looked at Orson. He smiled. "Appreciate it," he said to Orson. Orson didn't look up. They took Lenora's arms, and she didn't fight it, because Kit was somewhere in this, and fighting now would only make it worse. She looked at Hollis, and he looked back, and the message passed between them, clean and clear. He would not chase blindly. He would find another way. Bram's men dragged her south toward the canyon trail, and Kit was already there, wrapped in a horse blanket, sitting in the back of a wagon, his red scarf bright in the dark. She sat beside him and put her arm around him and felt him lean in, and from somewhere behind the wagon, as the wheels started moving, she heard it. A whistle, low, falling, 3 notes. Then a man's voice, weak and rough, calling through the wall of a locked stable, calling Hollis Creed's name. The stable wall was rough cedar, old enough that the wood had dried and shrunk and left gaps between the planks. Lenora pressed her face close and looked through. A man sat on the floor with his back against the far wall and his legs stretched out in front of him. Thin, too thin, with a beard that had grown past the point of being intentional. His right leg was wrapped in a piece of cloth that had started out clean a long time ago. "Who are you?" she said through the gap. The man turned his head slowly. His eyes found the gap. "Asa Creed," he said. His voice was rough and low. "Who are you?" She exhaled. "Someone trying to get you out of there." Kit had heard it from the wagon. He was already beside her. Both hands pressed flat against the cedar planks. "My name is Kit," he said through the wall. "My father is Hollis Creed." A long silence. "Kit," Asa said. "You were 4 years old the last time I saw you." "I know," Kit said. "Papa has a picture." Lenora heard something shift in Asa's breathing. She didn't give him long to sit with it because they didn't have long. "I'm going to get you out," she said. "Not tonight, but before dawn," Asa said. "Sloan moves Bird at first light. After that, he burns the compound." "I know. The workers," he said. "There are 8 men he's kept here. They're not criminals. They came looking for work and couldn't leave." "I'll get them out too," she said. "All of you." She pulled back from the wall and looked at Kit. He was already thinking. She could see it in his face. He'd taken after his father that way, quiet when it mattered. Asa spent what remained of the night telling her everything through the wall. He talked, and she listened, and where there were gaps, she filled them with what she already knew. Sloan had kept him alive because difficult horses responded to Asa the way they responded to almost no one else. He was too useful to kill and too dangerous to release, which was the particular misery of being valuable to the wrong person. He'd memorized everything, names, original brands, which animals came from which ranches. Every horse that had passed through the canyon for 2 years, Asa had cataloged in his head because it was the one thing they couldn't take from him. "The chestnut lead mare," Lenora said. "Bellwether. Is she still here?" "Third pen from the south gate," Asa said. "She's been here 4 months. They haven't moved her because the others follow her, and Sloan wants her for the final drive south." Lenora sat back on her heels. She looked at Kit. "You remember what I showed you about lead animals?" she said. "The herd follows whoever the lead mare trusts," Kit said. "That's why you always work with the lead first." "Exactly," she kept her voice low. "Bellwether knows me. I worked with her at a ranch in the Eastern Territory before Sloan's men took her. If I can get to her, I can move this entire herd." She paused. "But I need you to do something that I need you to listen to very carefully." Kit straightened. She taught him the whistle. 3 notes, low and falling, the same one she'd used to call Lark out of the trees. She made him practice it 4 times until he had it right. "Bellwether will come to that sound," she said. "If something happens to me, and the herd starts to scatter, you use it. You stand clear of the gate, and you use it, and you let her do the rest. The others will follow her. Nothing's going to happen to you, Kit said. Probably not, she agreed. But now you know what to do either way. Bram came at mid-morning and told her to walk the pens and identify the most valuable animals for first transport. He stood 3 feet behind her while she moved from pen to pen, and she understood that this was a test as much as a request. He wanted to see what she knew. She knew a great deal, so she showed him a little. She pointed out 4 horses with obvious value and kept her hands at her sides and her voice neutral. And while she walked, she was doing 2 other things simultaneously. She was identifying which gates opened from the outside versus the inside. And she was placing the calmest animals near the main gate, moving quietly from pen to pen, and coaxing the flighty ones toward the back with small pressures, a shifted shoulder, a slow step, until the horses closest to the exit were the ones most likely to move without panic. You know how to manage a herd drive? Bram asked. Yes, she said. Then you'll help direct the movement tonight. She nodded. Kit brought Asa water and dried biscuits from the workers' meal, passing them through the gap in the cedar planks. Nobody watched a 9-year-old closely enough. That was the error adults made consistently. Kit had understood this about himself for some time. Sloane came to her in the late afternoon. He walked her to the edge of the canyon rim and looked out at the grass below as though he was showing her something beautiful. I'm moving the herd tonight, he said. The compound will be closed down afterward. Workers reassigned. Records consolidated. He looked at her. You'll come south with the operation. Your knowledge is useful. I'm willing to make that arrangement professional rather than involuntary. You'll burn it, she said. The compound, with Asa inside. Asa is a complication I've been managing for 2 years, Sloane said. Complications eventually resolve themselves. She looked at the canyon below and thought about Hollis gathering ranchers in Briar Hollow. She thought about Tamsin's message to the territorial inspectors. She thought about the timing and whether it was tight enough and whether she could make the gap between too early and too late small enough to matter. I'll think about it, she said. Sloane smiled. Of course you will. The fire started before anyone planned it. She'd been working toward the stable, where Asa was held, moving along the east wall in the dark, when she heard Bram's voice behind her and turned and swung the stable fork before she'd fully decided to. The wood handle caught him across the forearms, and he went back into a fence post, and the lantern he'd been carrying hit the ground. Oil and fire and dry straw moved together the way they always do, which is faster than seems possible. She didn't watch it spread. She moved to Asa's stall and found Kit already there, the bar latch lifted, the door open, because Kit had been waiting for exactly this moment. Asa came out limping, one hand on the doorframe, blinking against the sudden light. She put his arm over her shoulders and they moved. Smoke was already filling the upper stable. The horses in the nearest pens had started screaming. Not the sharp scream of pain, but the rolling, continuous call of animals surrounded by something they can't reason with. Fire. Smoke. No exit they can see. Asa, she said. The workers. Which building? North cabin, he said. Unlocked. Go, she said. Kit goes with you, Lenora. Kit started. You know what to do, she said. I need you to do it. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he took Asa's other arm. She ran for Bellwether's pen. The mare was at the back of it, turned away from the smoke, trembling along her whole body. Lenora came in low and slow, despite every instinct telling her to hurry, because hurrying now would cost more time than it saved. Easy, she said. Easy. I've got you. She got the halter on and walked her toward the gate. And Bellwether trusted her because horses remember, which is one of the most important things about them. They carry good treatment forward the same way they carry fear. She opened the main gate. She put 2 fingers to her mouth. The whistle went out across the canyon compound, low and falling, 3 notes, and Bellwether walked through the gate. The herd turned. Bellwether walked, and the horses followed. That was the truth of led animals. You didn't drive a herd, not if you understood them. You gave them something to follow, and you trusted the instinct that had kept horses alive for longer than people had been around to complicate things. The herd followed the lead mare. The lead mare followed Lenora. The burning stable doors gave way behind them with a sound like a wave breaking, and the orange light threw long shadows across the canyon floor, and Lenora walked and didn't look back. She counted animals as they came through the main gate. 15, 20, 30. The outer pens had broken open in the crush, and horses she hadn't been able to reach were coming through anyway, following the movement, following the sound. Asa came out of the north cabin, with 7 men behind him, workers in worn clothes, with the particular expression of people who had stopped expecting rescue and were now trying to catch up to the reality of it. He pointed them north, away from the fire, and they went. Hollis came through the western gate. She saw him from across the compound, moving through the smoke on foot, his horse somewhere behind. He saw her at the same moment. He stopped and looked at the herd streaming past her, and his face did something she couldn't read at the distance, though she thought it might have been relief. He didn't come to her. He went to Bram. Bram had his rifle up, and it was pointed in her direction, and Hollis hit him from the side with his shoulder. And the shot went into the dirt, and Bram went down. Hollis stood over him and looked at him, and made the decision not to do anything further in about 2 seconds flat. He stepped back. He'd seen Sloane's horse disappear through the southern exit, with Kit's scarf left hanging from the saddle horn. He ran. The bridge was narrow, spanning a ravine cut deep by spring runoff. Sloane reached it, with Kit held against him. On the horse, one arm locked around the boy, the other holding the reins. He pulled up at the center of the bridge and looked down at the ravine and looked back at Hollis coming through the smoke. "Don't come closer," Sloane said. Hollis stopped. Kit's face was pale and completely still. He wasn't fighting. He was thinking, which was what Lenora had taught him to do. "The boy comes with me," Sloane said, "as insurance. You'll have him back once I'm across the territory line." "That's not going to happen," Hollis said. "You're in no position to." Kit put 2 fingers to his mouth. The whistle cut across the ravine, low and falling, 3 notes, and then a 4th, because Kit had added one, his own variation, the way people make something they've borrowed into something that belongs to them. Bellwether heard it. She turned. Lenora was already moving, already reading where the sound had come from, already pointing the lead mare toward the bridge road. The herd came behind in a wave, not panicked, but purposeful, and the thunder of it reached the bridge before the horses did. Sloane's horse heard them first. He shifted. He danced. He did what horses do when a herd comes toward them, which is respond to the collective urgency of moving animals. Because horses do not reason about it, they simply join. Sloane lost his grip on Kit. Kit dropped and rolled to the bridge rail and caught it with both hands and hung there, feet over the ravine, methodical about it, the way he'd been methodical about everything, since the night he knelt in the mud beside a stranger and pressed a red scarf against her arm. Hollis reached the bridge at a flat run and had Kit up and over the rail, and both of them clear before Sloane's horse finished turning. Sloane raised his arm. The shot never came. Orson came around the south end of the bridge, from the direction nobody had been watching, because nobody had been watching Orson, and he put his hand on Sloane's gun arm, and the sound of the shot went into the sky, and Orson sat down hard on the bridge, planking with his hand over his shoulder. The herd reached the bridge approach, and Lenora spread her arms wide, and Bellwether turned again. Following the pressure, following the gap she left in the air, and the herd turned with her, around the bridge, along the ravine edge, away from the crossing. She kept them moving. She pointed them north, Briar Hollow. The stolen herd came into Briar Hollow at mid-morning with Lenora at the front and Bellwether at her side, and several hundred horses coming behind in a column that stretched back past the edge of town. They came down Main Street, because Main Street was widest, and because it passed directly in front of the livestock market where Sloane's buyers were already gathered. People came out of buildings. They came out of the feed store and the boarding house and the blacksmith, and they stood on the street and looked, and then they started moving forward, slow at first and then faster, because they knew these animals. A rancher from the south end of the valley walked up to a spotted mare and put both hands on her face and stood there. A boy about Kit's age started running, pointing at a bay, gelding with a notch in his left ear. Tamsin Hale came out of the boarding house door and looked at Lenora and smiled, and Lenora understood that the message to the territorial inspectors had gone through. Asa arrived on horseback, one of the workers riding beside him for support, and he climbed down slowly and stood in the street and began pointing. He pointed and named, and the ranchers listened and found what he described. The original brands beneath the altered ones, the marks on the ears, the behavioral tells that no amount of dye or altered paperwork could cover. Sloane rode in behind, still trying to look composed, still trying to look like a man in control of a situation. "These animals belong to the Sloane Company," he said, addressing the gathering crowd. "I can produce documentation for every one of them." Lenora turned around. "Check the gray stallion's hip," she said clearly. "Lift the surface hair on the left side. You'll find a military breeding mark underneath." The horse was taken from a federal program. Two men near the stallion moved at once. Bram, brought in by Hollis's gathered ranchers with his hands tied to his saddle, looked at Sloane. Then he looked away. The calculation on his face was not subtle. Sloane was a man who had just run out of options, and Bram was a man deciding how far he wanted to go down with him. The territorial inspectors arrived with Tamsin's 2-day-old message still in one man's coat pocket. They worked efficiently. They examined brands and heard testimony and wrote in their ledgers, and Bram started talking before anyone asked him to. Sloane was arrested in front of the livestock market at noon, with the October sun directly overhead and every person in Briar Hollow watching. He didn't look at Lenora when they led him away. She hadn't expected him to. She found a water trough at the edge of the market yard and sat on the edge of it and let out a long breath. Bellwether came and pushed her nose against Lenora's shoulder, and Lenora put her arm around the mare's neck and stayed there until the shaking in her hands stopped. Kit found her first, then Hollis. Kit sat beside her on the trough without saying anything. Hollis stood on her other side and looked at the street, slowly returning to something ordinary. That afternoon, in the room Tamsin had given her at the boarding house, Lenora opened her travel bag. She took out a clean shirt. She took out the small journal she carried. She took out the train schedule she'd folded into the inside pocket. 6 days ago, Denver. A position at a horse hospital there. Clean work, professional respect, her name on a door. She set the schedule on the bed and looked at it. Then she started packing. Hollis found her before sunrise. He came down the boarding house hallway with his hat in his hands and stopped in the doorway when he saw the bag. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Denver," he said. "There's a position at a horse hospital," she said. "They want someone with my background." He nodded slowly. "That's good work, it is." She folded a shirt and placed it in the bag. "They'd know what they had. They wouldn't question whether I should be there." He came into the room and sat in the chair beside the window. He didn't try to take the bag or stop her hands. He just sat there and let her talk. "People here already have a story about me," she said. "The woman Hollis Creed rescued. That's what they'll say for the next 20 years. She looked at him. "I need to be somewhere that story isn't the first thing." He was quiet. Outside, the street was still gray and empty. "I don't want your gratitude," he said finally. "I don't want obedience. I don't want someone to be a mother to Kit because we survived something together." He looked at his hat. "I want you to have a life that belongs to you, whatever shape that is." She stopped folding. "The problem," she said, "is that I packed this bag before the canyon. I packed it because I expected you to tell me to go once it was over." She looked at the schedule on the bed. That expectation came from a long time of people doing exactly that. She paused. You haven't done that. I know, she said. Kit appeared in the doorway. He looked at the bag. He looked at his father. He looked at Lenora with the expression he used when he'd already understood something and was waiting to see if the adults would catch up. You're not leaving because of me, he said. It wasn't a question. No, Lenora said. You're one of the reasons I've been thinking about staying. Kit sat down on the end of the bed. Orson said, you can want two different things at once, and it doesn't mean you're confused. It means you're paying attention. Hollis looked at his son. Orson said that? Yesterday, while you were talking to the inspectors. Kit shrugged. He says things sometimes. Lenora sat down beside the bag. She thought about the Denver position, the clean facility, the professional respect, the door with her name on it. All of it real, all of it earned, all of it waiting. She thought about Bellwether grazing in the morning light, about Juniper's particular walk when his hooves didn't hurt, about Kit's hands pressing a red scarf against a stranger's arm in the mud, about Hollis asking permission before he touched anything. I'm not going to pretend the fear is gone, she said. The part of me that's been leaving places before they matter. It doesn't just stop. I know, Hollis said. But leaving and abandonment aren't the same thing, she said. I know that now, and I don't want to go because I'm afraid. I've done that enough. She picked up the train schedule and folded it once more and set it on the windowsill. I'm not taking the full position, she said. I'm going to write them and arrange occasional visits instead. Hollis looked at her carefully. Lenora, I'm not staying because you need me, she said. I'm staying because I want to. There's a difference, and I need you to understand. It's the second one. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled. Not relief, exactly. More like a man who has been bracing for something, and finally put the weight down. I'd like to build the treatment stalls on the east side of the stable, she said. Separated from the main stable so the horses recovering don't get agitated by the working animals. Good light in the morning. Drainage that runs away from the structure, he said. I'll build them however you tell me to. I know you will. Kit stood up. He crossed the room and picked up her travel bag and carried it toward the door. Then he stopped and looked back. Are we going home, he said. Lenora looked at Hollis. He looked at her. Yes, she said. They were back at Creed Station by noon. Asa was already there, installed in the bunkhouse, eating steadily and methodically in the way of a man making up for a significant deficit. Beatrix had looked at his leg and said the infection was manageable, and that he was fortunate and stubborn, which she delivered as though they were the same quality. Asa looked up when Lenora came through the bunkhouse door and said, You're the one who knew Lark. Yes, she said. She's in the far pasture, he said. She's been following Bellwether around like she's catching up on 2 years of conversation. He paused. Thank you for knowing her. For knowing what she meant? Lenora nodded. She went to work. The treatment stalls went up over the following 2 weeks, Hollis building to her specifications without offering modifications unless she asked. He had opinions. He kept most of them to himself until she invited them, and when she did, he gave them plainly and accepted her answers the same way. It was a useful way to work with someone. She thought they could probably do it for a long time. Orson recovered from his shoulder wound at Tamsin's boarding house, where Tamsin brought him soup and told him he was foolish, and he agreed with her on both counts. He gave his testimony to the territorial inspectors across 2 full days and held nothing back. When it was done, he looked smaller and lighter at the same time, the way people do when they've been carrying something long enough that they've forgotten what it feels like not to. Tamsin organized the new cooperative livestock market on the site of Sloane's old office building. She did it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been watching something be done wrong for years and had been composing the correct version in her head the whole time. Beatrix received a portion of Sloane's confiscated property and began converting the building on the edge of town into a permanent clinic. She told people she'd been wanting to do it for a decade and had been waiting for someone to accidentally create the opportunity. Asa decided to stay in the territory. There were ranchers who needed help identifying and reclaiming stolen horses, and he was the most qualified person for that work. He said it plainly, without drama, as though the 2 years he'd spent, locked in a canyon, had clarified rather than complicated his sense of direction. The territorial officials returned, every horse from Hollis's seized herd. They came back one string at a time over several weeks, and Lenora examined each animal when they arrived and noted which ones needed work, and started a ledger that eventually became the foundation records of Voss Horse Care and Recovery. She painted the name on the sign herself. Hollis held the ladder. He asked her, on an evening in late November, when the first real cold had come down from the north, and the horses were settled, and Kit was inside with a book, whether she would freely choose to build a future with him. He used that word, freely, and she understood what he meant by it. She said yes. They didn't rush. There was no ceremony that winter, no announcement, no sudden transformation of one life into another. What there was, a shared table, a shared purpose, a boy who had decided she was staying and reorganized his life around that fact. The practical confidence of someone for whom the adjustment was obvious. On the first clear day of December, Kit took the red scarf from around his neck and climbed the short ladder he'd leaned against the entrance to Lenora's treatment stable. He hung the scarf on the nail above the door. It was faded now. The red had gone softer, more like the color of old bricks, worn down by several months of weather and use, and one very muddy night on a trail outside Briar Hollow. He climbed back down, and Juniper came to him from across the yard, trotting on 4 sound hooves, and Kit ran his hand down the pony's neck the way Lenora had shown him, checking for heat, checking the rhythm of the breath. Bellwether grazed in the far pasture. Lark was beside her, the 2 mares standing close enough that their shoulders touched. Asa was repairing a section of fence along the east property line, moving slowly but steadily, stopping now and then to rest his leg. Hollis stood at the stable entrance and watched the evening come down over the grass and the buildings and the horses moving in the low gold light. Lenora stood beside him. She had work bearing her own name. She had ground she'd chosen to stand on. She had 2 people who hadn't asked her to be anyone other than herself, and a boy who had decided, on a rainy night 9 weeks ago, that she was worth kneeling in the mud for. The scarf hung above the door and moved in the cold air. Nobody was being left behind. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Kit takes his faded red scarf, the same one he pulled off his own neck in the mud on a rainy night, and he climbs a ladder and hangs it above the door of Lenora's stable. Not as a decoration, as a marker, as proof that something happened here that mattered. That scarf is the whole story in one image. A 9-year-old boy saw a stranger bleeding in the dirt and made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy or safety or whether it was convenient. He just knelt down. He just stayed. And because he stayed, everything else became possible. The rescue, the truth, the justice, the home that Lenora never thought she'd have. None of it happens if Kit gets back on his pony when his father told him to. We talk a lot about big acts of courage, the dramatic ones, the ones that look good from the outside. But this story keeps asking a quieter question. What does it cost you to stay when leaving would be easier? Hollis could have left Lenora on the trail. It was the safer choice. He had a son to protect, and a station to run, and a stranger who might bring nothing but trouble. He stayed anyway, and it cost him. It cost him his horses, his freedom for a night, his sense of control over everything he'd built. But what it gave him was a partner who chose him back, not out of gratitude, not out of obligation, but freely. That word matters. Lenora doesn't stay because she owes him. She stays because she wants to. That's the only version of staying that means anything. Lenora herself carries something a lot of us recognize. She spent years leaving before a place could matter to her. Before someone could decide to leave her first, she called it practical. She told herself it made sense, that horses move, and so should the people who care for them. But the truth she finally arrives at is simpler and harder than that. She was afraid. Afraid that needing people makes you weak. Afraid that the moment you let somewhere feel like home, you hand someone the power to take it from you. What the story shows her, what it shows us, is that needing people doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And there is a difference, an important one, between leaving because you're afraid and leaving because you've made a real choice. Lenora stops running, not because she finds a perfect situation with no risk. She stops running because she finally decides that the fear is not a good enough reason to go. Hollis has his own lesson to learn, and it's one that's harder for him to see. He loves the people in his life by trying to control the danger around them. He thinks protection means removing choice, removing risk, removing the possibility that someone he cares about might get hurt. What Lenora tells him, clearly and without cruelty, is that protecting someone doesn't give you ownership over what they choose. Love that demands someone become smaller to stay safe isn't protection. It's a different kind of trap. Hollis has to learn to trust not just in Lenora's skills, which he comes to respect, but in her right to decide her own life. When he finally gets there, when he asks her whether she would freely choose to build a future with him, that word freely is the whole journey in a single syllable. This story is a work of fiction written for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental.